We're running short on time, everyone, so I've been asked to get us started. We're going to run this panel until 4 o'clock, when a couple of our panelists have a hard stop and need to walk out the door. My name is David Sandalo. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Thank you to Patchy, thank you to Annapurna, thank you to everybody who organized this conference. About 3 weeks ago now, I was sitting in Delhi at the opening session of the Clean Energy Ministerial when Prime Minister Singh came to open the session and spoke movingly about energy, about the importance of energy access for development. And I think both with his presence and with his words, he underscored the central importance of all of the topics that are being discussed in this conference today. We have really a remarkable panel here, and I am going to start by kicking off only by introducing a man who's been an admirer of John Holdren's for at least a couple of decades, first before I met him from his writings, and then when I had the privilege of meeting him in the Clinton administration. He is, as I think everybody here knows, the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of OSTP, but his contributions on the issues we're talking about go well beyond that. He's been a visionary who shaped a lot of people's thinking on the issues in discussion at this conference, and so it is my great pleasure to introduce John Holdren.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to Pachi and his crew for putting this together. I'm going to run through my slides very quickly because we are short of time. We'll post them, as usual, on the OSTP website so that if there's any detail that you want to come back to, you'll be able to get at it. But I start very briefly, and I don't think I need to say much about this because I'm sure Al Gore did a fabulous job last night. But the way I describe the essence of the energy climate challenge is that without energy there is no economy, but without climate there is no environment, and without economy and environment there's no national well-being, no civil society, no personal or national security. And the problem is, whoops, went too far there. The problem is that the world is getting most of the energy that its economies need in ways that are imperiling the climate that its environment needs. And if you look at the trajectory of global CO2 emissions, 1990 to 2011, you see an interesting pattern, although the per capita emissions of CO2 are still far smaller in the developing world than in the industrialized countries. The developing world has a lot of capitas, and therefore they actually passed the developing countries in aggregate emissions of CO2 in 2005 and passed the sum of the industrial and transition economies in 2008. And what that tells us is that the problem cannot be solved without the participation of both parts of this picture. If you look in a little more detail, these are figures for 2011 because the complete data for 2012 aren't available yet. But what one finds is that the world is still astonishingly dependent on fossil fuels. The world as a whole, 84% of its energy coming from fossil fuels, and that includes the contribution, by the way, from traditional biofuels in that total. If you didn't include the traditional biofuels, which are still important across most of the developing world, the fossil fuel percentage would be even higher. The other message one wants to note here is that India is in third place. These are globally the countries with the largest emissions. India is in third place, now well ahead of Russia. And China, the United States, and India among them account for half of the global emissions of CO2. The United States government has had a long-standing commitment to clean energy and climate finance. I think Todd and others will talk more about this. A few examples here: the U.S. Fast Start Climate Finance initiative. OPEC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, has been rapidly increasing its commitments in renewable resources. A lot of things going on there. There are, of course, global institutions for clean energy and climate finance. Most importantly, the World Bank and its associated International Finance Corporation, and of course the Global Environment Facility. And there too, there are ever strengthening commitments in particular to fund clean and efficient energy as well as climate change resilience. But one does need to keep in mind, in thinking about financing and in the context of capital flows more generally, that official development assistance is actually a very small part, now only about 15% of the OECD capital flows to developing countries. You see private sector capital flows are much bigger, even remittances are bigger. Private philanthropy, smaller, but about half, actually, of official development assistance. Figure out which way I need to point this thing to get it to go. There we go. So if you try to put those capital flows in context for the case of India, it's quite remarkable. Development aid to India totaled in 2011 about $3.2 billion. Foreign direct investment totaled 10 times as much, $32 billion. So what the private sector is doing in terms of foreign direct investment is 10 times as big as development aid. Remittances, twice as big as that, $64 billion for India in 2011. Government spending, $285 billion. Trade, total imports to India, $570 billion. And gross domestic investment, about $700 billion in India. So when one thinks about what the possibilities are and where the leverage is, we certainly need to think about how to condition and shape the environments in which these larger flows take place, and not just about the smaller flows over which government entities and multilateral entities have direct control. I think I may need some help from the control room here. There we go. Another point worth making is that clean energy projects often require sequencing different types of capital. That is, more than one of these kinds of entities combine in sequence. This example of Husk Power, an Indian startup based around rice husk-fired power generators, has had funding initially from private philanthropy, the Shell Foundation, then domestic public finance, subsidy from the Indian Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, then private sector capital, and finally development finance institution funding from OPIC. And these combinations are increasingly important. This thing has apparently ceased to function. But I want to emphasize in the mode of talking about the larger context for thinking about these issues that there are important modes of international cooperation germane to energy technology development and deployment besides financing per se. There are science and technology transfer and sharing activities that go on by multinational corporations, commercial joint ventures in high-tech industries, university to university, lab to lab, and agency to agency cooperative agreements, and of course large-scale multilateral science and technology projects, which include some in energy. President Obama is strongly committed, has been from the beginning, to cooperation in science, technology, and innovation internationally, including, of course, in matters of energy and climate change. The cooperation between the United States and India has predated the Obama administration, of course. The number of landmarks here, various cooperation agreements, the Indo-U.S. Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement in 2005. The U.S. India Energy Dialogue was launched in that year. The first ministerial level joint commission meeting on science and technology cooperation was in 2006. Agreement on peaceful nuclear energy, of course, in 2007. These energy partnership summits, of course, as you doubtless already heard, started in 2009 and have continued every year. We had an MOU on energy security, clean energy, and climate change in November of 2009, which included both setting up the U.S. India Clean Energy Research and Deployment Initiative and a bilateral dialogue on climate change. Landmarks continue with the strategic dialogue, U.S. India Strategic Dialogue, which had a major focus on energy security, clean energy, and climate change. That is coming up again next month. U.S. India Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, established in November 2010. 2011 saw a number of developments, including the first round of proposals for consortia constituting the U.S. India Joint Clean Energy Research and Development Center. 2012 awards to 3 of those: solar energy, advanced biofuels, and building efficiency. And then, of course, there's multilateral clean energy cooperation engaging the United States and India, the centerpiece of which is the Clean Energy Ministerial, the fourth one of which just took place in Delhi, as David Sandelow said. He was there in April, just last month. And that initiative, the Clean Energy Ministerial, is engaging 23 governments, including the United States and India, and has major initiatives on efficiency, on supply, and cross-cutting initiatives. And I'm sure the list is longer now. I made that list up from the third CEM, but I'm sure the fourth has a longer list. And I'm going to stop there in the interest of time and hope that the panelists will fill in the blanks. Thank you.
Thank you, John, both for your impressive insights and brevity. So we decided as a panel that the rest of the panelists will speak sitting down, and that we will go in alphabetical order. And so we're going to have some opening remarks by each of the other panelists for 4 or 5 minutes each, and then have a discussion. And we'll start with Steve Gervin, who's the Deputy Provost for Science and Technology at Yale, in which capacity he has oversight for many natural science and engineering departments, as well as, among many other things, the Yale Climate and Energy Institute. Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here representing Yale University, which has partnered with Pachori and Terry in convening this series of conferences. It's also been a real privilege working with Patchy to establish the Yale Climate and Energy Institute. This institute, together with the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, form overlapping umbrellas covering a myriad of efforts in research in climate and energy at Yale. The third partner in this effort, the Yale Energy Sciences Institute, is carrying out fundamental research needed to eventually make things like solar fuels and carbon capture and sequestration into practical technologies. Yale takes its long-range strategic planning very seriously, and the planning that we, and indeed the world, must now do is perhaps the most serious in our history. The Yale Climate and Energy Institute is just beginning to develop a multi-university research consortium to carry out detailed modeling of climate change and extreme weather events in the northeastern region of the United States over the next century. And one can easily imagine the utility of a parallel project for a selected region of India. We've known about the greenhouse gas problem for a surprisingly long time. By the end of the 19th century, the physics of the mechanism by which CO2 warms the Earth was well understood. And as early as 1917, the great technologist Alexander Graham Bell began to advocate for alternatives to burning fossil fuels to prevent the buildup of CO2 and the concomitant greenhouse effect. Nobody listened. As a quantum physicist, I'm afraid I know very little about international finance, but I can make some general remarks about the financing of research. The benefits of financing unfettered, curiosity-driven research are enormous in the long run. A fable I like to tell is the following. Imagine a top-down government directive to Charles Towns in the 1940s to drop his apparently useless research on precision quantum measurements of atoms and to start a program on something practical like better methods for recording sound. This likely would have led to better vinyl phonograph records rather than the laser. I hope some of you here remember what a phonograph record is. It took 60 years of patient and dedicated research to understand the curious properties of the quantum world well enough to develop the maser and the laser. And even then, the inventors could not possibly have foreseen the myriad resulting technologies that have revolutionized our world, leading not just to better sound recording via DVDs, but to optical fiber and global positioning systems and so forth. On the other hand, humanity may not have 60 years left to find a preemptive solution to the climate problem, and we need a sensible balance between fundamental and programmatic research. we academics face the hard fact that a researcher being in love with his or her new idea is simply not a guaranteed recipe for financial success or widespread adoption of the technology. While surprises are perhaps the most important benefit of basic research, they can be bad in technology rollout, as we all know from the law of unintended consequences. In light of this, we need to have a thorough understanding of the social contexts which affect the adoption of new technologies, non-traditional cook stoves being a good example. One example of surprising twists and turns in technology deployment is the following. Yale engineers have developed a marvelous forward osmosis system for water purification, originally intended and very effective at lowering the cost of desalination in water-starved areas. The company selling the technology now finds a high-demand market in cleaning up wastewater from fracking operations for shale gas production in the U.S. So one can ask whether this technology is good or bad for the environment, and it's a complicated answer. Yale has, in the last few years, embarked upon a major intellectual initiative focused on India and South Asia, and I'm pleased to be here at this summit learning more about the potential for joint economic and scientific collaboration, and I'd be happy to continue conversations with anyone here who might be interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I noticed when we decided to go in alphabetical order that 4 of our 5 speakers have their names start with S. But reverting to the second letter, the name of our next speaker is Mickey Schulhoff, who's the chairman of GTI Holdings, which is a New York-based firm that specializes in private equity fund investments, and an entrepreneur, and has very interesting experience in India to share.
So I come at this from a very different lens. Compared to government spending, large corporate spending, my interests are down in the weeds. I like starting new ventures. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I have discovered over the last 17 years when I've changed careers, I was running a multi-billion-dollar major corporation and decided that it was time for a phase transition, as the physicists on this table would call it, and moved into starting new companies. Stumbled across Terry and took one of Terry's technologies and developed it into a company which is now Houston-based. I have 8 other companies in India, and India, to me, forms an interesting laboratory from which new ideas can be tested, tried, and then expanded upon. I don't view India as just simply an export market from which to ship things being made in the United States or Europe. So as an entrepreneur and looking at new ventures, I've entrepreneurially, or at least empirically, told myself that there are basically 5 ingredients necessary to start a new venture. It requires a good idea. Good ideas are easy to think about on the surface, very difficult to actually implement into a real operating business. It requires some capital, not the kind of capital that was talked about earlier in the multi-billions, because you can suffocate a company at its early stage with too much money. It requires a passion on the part of management, because without somebody willing to work 24/7 to develop the idea into an operating enterprise, things just don't happen. And perhaps most important of all, it requires an absolute maniacal attention to focus and a sense of urgency. As Andy Grove would have said, only the paranoid survive. So my lens is taking ideas from India or elsewhere and building them into companies. Over the last 17 years, I've done that 25 times. I've had a few successes, some multi-billion-dollar ventures that still exist, and a lot of failures. But the whole understanding of risk-taking and how to manage risk forms, at least in my world, the basic element of how to take ideas and translate them. Terry, which is the reason I'm here, is a beehive of innovation. It's got a group of both dedicated scientists and engineers led by a very capable management team. And when I look at energy, sustainable development, biotech, I see a cornucopia of things which could become the basis for developing new business ventures. And I don't delude myself into believing that every one of them will change the world. But I think that if there are enough people who see those possibilities and enough people that try them, that actually some changing of the world is possible. In my humble world, trying to trickle down by government policy the choice of winners and losers is a very problematic game. I've only seen it successful once that I'm aware of, and that was in the 1980s in Japan when MIDI basically called all the shots and actually, I think, was successful at it. I just haven't seen it happen elsewhere. So the one example I would give you is a company that I developed based in Houston, Texas, called Glory Energy. It uses a biotech technology that comes out of Terry to encourage the large population change of naturally occurring microbes that are in every oil well in the world. As most of you would know, over 65% of all of the world's proven reserves remain trapped in the rocks or the reservoirs. Releasing them is a game changer, and it is what we tried to do at this company. We've been at it for 5 years. We finally think we've broken through not the mystique, but actually the implementation, the know-how that goes beyond the science, and are consistently getting 70% increases in oil output above the baseline well production at an average cost per barrel of under $5 per incremental barrel. Along the way, I've attracted more capital because an entrepreneur's pocketbook is always limited. Even if he has the money, it's still limited. And we're now applying this technology in 10 countries around the world beyond the United States. So I view a panel like this as intimidating to me because the other gentlemen here are very sophisticated. They deal with very large, controlled purse strings. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, people like me have to make do. But somehow that's also part of the excitement and part of the motivation.
Thank you very much. Jeff Sebright is the Vice President for Environment and Water Resources at the Coca-Cola Company. Jeff had distinguished history in government, serving in a number of positions in Senate staff and USAID, and then as Executive Director of the White House Climate Change Task Force before his service at Coca-Cola.
Great. Well, thank you, David. And let me also echo the recognition to Pachi for your continued leadership on energy, environment, and development. I've had the pleasure of working with Pachi and Terry, both in government and now in the private sector, and it's really been terrific. And the leadership is critical. I'm the Chief Environmental Officer at Coca-Cola. We have a very large operation in India. We have 56 manufacturing sites, 25,000 employees. And I only wish that we had some of our Indian products like Thumbs Up, Limca, Maaza, and Nimbu Fresh here to refresh everybody for this afternoon session, but we'll have to do with the products that are outside the room here. John Holdren talked about foreign direct investment as a major capital flow in terms of the opportunity to shape energy efficiency and renewable financing. The Coca-Cola Company has committed to invest $5 billion in India between now and 2020 to continue to grow our business, both in the manufacturing and the retail side and in cold drink equipment. And we know that that investment has got to be made in a way that is compatible with the challenges around sustainability. So we've set some pretty aggressive goals, 50% renewable energy by 2020. Most of that is being met through biomass in power generation in situ. We're also targeting a 5% year-on-year energy efficiency improvement, and we're on track for that. As I mentioned in the Women in the Green Economy session earlier today, we've also innovated a solar cooler technology for off-grid applications that makes available both chilled products in places where those are not now available, but that same solar energy can be used for lantern charging and cell phone charging and enabling all of those services. And we're really working aggressively to include women as part of that sort of entrepreneurial retail focus. And then lastly, we're very committed to phasing out of hydrofluorocarbons in our refrigeration equipment around the world. We buy about 1.5 million units a year, making us arguably the largest buyer of commercial refrigeration equipment. And as we all know, hydrofluorocarbons are a very climate-damaging gas, and so we're moving very aggressively to replace HFCs in all of our new procurement as of 2015, including in our operations in India. I think one of the things, just to think about energy efficiency and renewables going forward, I think much of the energy infrastructure and the demand it remains to be built, right? The big future growth that is certainly anticipated in India is something that represents a tremendous opportunity. So as we invest that $5 billion, we want to make sure that we're investing it in ways that are as energy efficient and as clean as possible. And I think with respect to that, one of the things that was touched on yesterday at the CEO Summit, and some of you in the room were here for that, talk was really around increasing open access, power purchase agreements, to open up the energy markets in India. And Deepak Amitabh from PTC India Limited, the chairman, I think made a very eloquent statement on that front. And states like Gujarat and Haryana and Punjab are really taking a leading position in this. And I think this is going to be a very important way to incent more merchant power in the renewable sector for direct sales to customers like Coca-Cola and others. So I think that's going to be an important area. And then certainly efficiency. Something on the order of 30% of effective demand could be cut through cost-effective efficiency improvements according to various analyses. We know there's a lot of opportunity there. And how to unlock that. And I know Bill Sisson to my left from United Technologies is going to talk more about that. But there's a limit to companies like mine in terms of what we can do in our plants around energy efficiency. We're in the beverage business. We're not energy efficiency managers, although we're learning to be that. We need the help of professionals, energy service companies, energy performance contracting, and so helping find ways to create an enabling environment. And then lastly, but very importantly, is really setting the right kinds of building standards and ratings. And the work that Terry has led on the GRIHA rating system in India, which is sort of the equivalent of the LEED certification, but really for the Indian context, is critically important to help drive that kind of high bar for improvements in the built environment. So I think those are just some very brief observations from a perspective of a multinational operating in India.
Many thanks, Jeff. So for another business perspective, we have William Sisson, who is the Director of Sustainability at United Technologies Research Center. And from 2006 to 2009, he served as co-chair of United Technologies Corporation and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's Energy Efficiency in Buildings project. And he's worked at UTC in a variety of technical and business leadership positions. The floor is yours.
Thanks, David. And it's an honor to be up here with such a distinguished panel. And thank you, Patchy, for helping to pull this whole organized event together, and Annapurna as well. As Jeff points out, we're another multinational up here. We have a large presence in India and a necessity to explore the types of growth that our corporation can make in India. United Technologies is companies you know like Carrier, air conditioning, Otis Elevator, Pratt & Whitney gas turbine engines, Sikorsky helicopters, and a few others that make us one of the largest corporations in the world. Having said that, I want to dwell right in on the setup that Jeff gave me, which is the role that buildings play in energy consumption. And the numbers are out there, I'm sure you all know, but just to reiterate, of all the things we've talked about today, the largest consumer of energy is buildings, for roughly 40%. And when we think about the growth of population, but also the growth of urban centers, 40%, if we do nothing, is going to accelerate as that population accelerates. So as a corporation that provides goods and services into that market, we have to think of ways to offer goods and services that are more efficient and that are more attractive for an efficient marketplace. That 30% number that Jeff referred to is one that we think about a lot. 30% energy savings can produce returns that are within 3 years or better. Those types of technologies that are available to produce those types of savings are available today in the marketplace, and they have attractive returns. We also know that that market for 30% efficiency globally is $2.6 trillion. So when you put those two pieces of data together, you have to wonder why this just isn't happening at scale. And so the subject here is financing. And financing is an important aspect of that, but I think we have to also understand that there are other factors that are needing to be overcome in this context as well. And I would just challenge the panelists to think about the information barriers that are in the building sector, the behavior barriers, there's transaction barriers, and last but not least, there are financial barriers. So I believe there should be easier access to capital that addresses both the incentive for the marketplace to go after energy efficiency investments, but also to ideally address some of these other barriers that are in the way. A recent Resources for the Future study here in the United States, and I think part of my comments are reflective of the programs we have here in the U.S. and in some sense how scalable and deployable they might be if we can get them to work here in the U.S. To India. The Resources for Future study identified 52 state-based programs, 51 local programs, and 103 utility programs set up here in the U.S., all structured to provide some level of financing incentive to businesses and consumers for improving the efficiency of their buildings. The bad news is less than 5% of the accessible market is taking advantage of those programs. There's an issue that's very fundamental here, and I think, is it financing that leads the market, or is it something else? And so I've been spending a fair amount of my time thinking about the role that information plays. And I've made a few comments along the way over the last few days on this initiation of information-based programs here in the U.S., but also in India, in particular disclosure programs that are set up now in 7 cities around the U.S., mandating energy performance or energy information be made publicly available, and 2 state-level programs that are now doing the same thing. That information goes back to financing in 2 ways. One, it starts to inform the market that energy efficiency increases value of the property in some way. Second, it helps the financial institutions get the data they need to look at the risk and uncertainty aspects of financing for energy efficiency. And then the other sort of co-benefits that go along start to be better realized and understood. So I think the importance of information, disclosure, labeling are all fundamental to breaking down those earlier barriers I mentioned and allowing the financial and financing community to come in and play with products and offers that can ultimately spin out that 30% or greater improvement we talked about earlier. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Bill. Last and definitely not least is another person that I've admired and had the chance to work with for many years, Todd Stern, who's the Special Envoy for Climate Change at the State Department. Todd has played a central role both for this president and for President Clinton in international and domestic climate policy. He today represents the United States at the ministerial level in multilateral and bilateral climate negotiations. It's my delight to introduce Todd Stern.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you. Get this a little closer to me. Thank you, everybody here, for coming. Thanks to my old friend Pachi for the invitation, and to Yale for co-sponsoring this event with Terry. I'm very pleased to be here. I thought I would speak a little bit on the perspective, from the perspective of a climate negotiator. The issue of finance is a central one in the long-running, I'm sure we're going to break every Broadway record, climate negotiations, which have in one way or another been going on since the early 1990s and with no end in sight. There is has been a huge focus and an ongoing focus from the poorer countries, developing countries, for financing to be provided by wealthier countries, the developed countries. And in the Copenhagen negotiation in 2009, there were essentially three main agreements that were reached with respect to funding, and those were then amplified and embellished at the next year's large climate meeting in Cancun. And those three agreements were first for Fast Start funding, so-called Fast Start, for the period between 2010 and 2012. The donor countries agreed to provide roughly $30 billion, and that was understood to be from public sources. There was also an agreement by the donor countries to provide $100 billion a year from all sources, public, private, carbon markets, all sources, by 2020. And there was an agreement to set up a new fund which took the shape of the Green Climate Fund. On the Fast Start piece was basically realized. There was, the last numbers that I saw were slightly over $30 billion in what was provided. The U.S., for its part, put together about $7.5 billion over that three-year period, which is, on a per-year basis, far, far in excess of what we were doing at the time President Obama was first elected. We approach these issues now, and we approach the challenge of providing ongoing funding, and funding that, as I said, is supposed to ramp up from all sources by 2020. We approach this challenge in a fiscally constrained environment. So it's crucial from our point of view to take as much public funding as possible, but then to leverage it to the maximum feasible extent. You need a lever, that's the public money, but you need to leverage it, and that's the effort to mobilize private capital. Let me turn now to our experience with India and see how some of these issues have played out there and continue to play out. India has a very impressive clean energy policy environment, and that's crucially important. And that has been a important reason why we have focused a lot on funding to India and on mobilizing investment. As John Holdren mentioned, there in 2009, President Obama and Prime Minister Singh launched the U.S. India Partnership to advance clean energy, as well as a number of other related programs. Since PACE's inception, the U.S. government has mobilized more than $1.8 billion in public and private resources for clean energy deployment in India, which includes about $740 million from OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation. That's essentially our development finance institution. Another 400 or so from the Exim Bank, and then another 700 million in private capital that was leveraged by the OPIC investment. And this funding has gone, among other things, to help source and help finance about nearly 400 megawatts of solar capacity in India, about 40% of what's been put in to date. The Indian government's own efforts to attract investment have been crucial and have been the key. India's solar mission is an important policy initiative. They have used methods such as a reverse auction for their feed-in tariff, which is a very effective policy mechanism. They've started a national mechanism, a national mission for enhanced energy efficiency and the like. In terms of our work with India, we've focused on specific tools and interventions meant to overcome barriers. And I'll give you a few examples. We have helped India in developing their enabling environments. We have, for example, a 5-year, $20 million effort that USAID is sponsoring to strengthen the regulatory framework there. Second, we have been providing grant assistance to help close the cost gap between essentially green energy and brown energy, if you will, and including through multilateral funds like the GEF. The U.S. is the largest contributor to the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and the GEF is providing about $18 million to India, which is meant to leverage nearly $600 million in co-financing through a partial risk-sharing facility for energy efficiency. Essentially, it will enhance the access to commercial loans and extend the payback period, all of which makes funding cheaper. Third, we have been providing very critical risk mitigation facilities, mostly through OPIC, and also scaling up the availability of debt financing, again through OPIC and the Exim Bank. There continue to be challenges in India. The local debt is expensive. There is a lack of full stability in among the state-owned power distribution companies, and that in turn has an effect on the riskiness or not of power purchase agreements that are long-term. The less risky they are, the better it is, the cheaper the financing is, the more things can get financed. And India also has, at this stage, a local content requirement with respect to solar energy, which is understandable in one regard, but also causes some problems with respect to the U.S. Capacity to provide assistance. But overall, the U.S. is highly committed to this partnership. It's a very engaged one. It's been a very effective one, and we intend to continue it.
Many thanks, Todd. So our time is short. I want to leave some time for questions from the floor, but let me just hit on two broad themes for questions before we do that. I want to ask both about the role of government and about science and technology. And first, on the role of government, it's clearly a theme that's gone throughout all of these remarks. John Holdren talked about 10 times the capital flows in private sector. Others, we had, I think, some skepticism about government's ability to help from one or two panelists and discussion of government programs. I'd just throw out the question, should the subtopic for this conference is stimulating technology, trade, and development. In order to do that, should government be helping or should government be getting out of the way?
Well, I'll take an initial shot at that. I think government has to help. There are a whole variety of ways in which government shapes the environment, in which private investments are made, in which capital flows take place, and in which technology gets advanced. The provost of Yale, Steve Girvin, made the point that fundamental research is crucial to every domain of applied advance that we need. Governments will remain the primary funder of that fundamental research, which is the seed corn, if you will, for all the kinds of applied advances that we'd like to see in the clean and efficient energy domain in the future. Even though it is true, as Bill Sisson pointed out, that there is already a wide array of technologies in the marketplace that would be cost-effective and that could bring us big gains. In the long run, we're going to need to do a number of things for an encore, and the government's role in that domain, again, funding the fundamental research that will be the basis of that encore, is going to be crucial. But we also need to look at things like subsidies and tax policy in relation to these things. I mean, we are still, notwithstanding commitments to the contrary, we are still subsidizing the fossil fuels, which are the principal driver of climate change. to the tune worldwide of multi-hundreds of billions of dollars per year. The subsidies for renewables, by contrast, are worldwide under $100 billion per year. We ought to level that playing field. And there are a number of other things that the government should be doing.
Other thoughts, comments?
So my reaction would be very supportive of John's perspectives in the first place. In the second place, I think there's the role of government is to look carefully at where these, I hesitate to call them market failures, but that's what generally everybody accepts that as a term, where these market failures exist and establish and try to drive policies and regulations that are in effect to undo those failures. And I think, again, I just cite information and disclosure as one of those cases where I think the governments are doing the right thing by imposing these structures in such a way as to make the markets operate more efficiently. And so that's where they need to focus their laser-like attention as governments to do this.
Thank you.
I'll offer a contrarian view. I think government's role has to be in financing and supporting endeavors which the private sector simply cannot do by itself. Private sector cannot put a man on the moon. The private sector could develop a supersonic aircraft. When the government endeavored to insert itself in a supersonic aircraft program some years ago, it didn't work. And I think the number of examples where the government's involvement tilts the playing field is more harmful than helpful for those things where the private sector is perfectly capable. If there's an altering of the profit motive for private companies to develop things for which there is adequate financing, then I think that ultimately it destroys the incentives necessary for companies to actually achieve efficiency and growth. On the other hand, if it's a question of tax policy, there I'm completely in agreement. And I think that the examples of tax policy to promote private investment, there are many, and I would just like to see more of them.
All right, let me just move to a question on science and technology, because both our two countries, U.S. and India, really have extraordinary scientific and technical infrastructures with remarkable talent. And I know at U.S. Department of Energy, where I worked for most of the past 4 years, we put a lot of time and effort into trying to build joint clean energy programs, which Dr. Holdren referred to in his presentation. And we had actually the first time ever that the U.S. Department of Energy has done a joint solicitation with another country where we had our funding awards done by panels of countries. But I wonder, what can we do to promote innovation in our two countries together? Are there steps that we can be taking to build upon this common heritage that any of the panelists would like to comment on?
Well, there are a lot of things that we can do to make it easier to collaborate. Issues such as visa policy, intellectual property rights policy, policies that make it easier for people to move back and forth, easier to reach agreement on joint activities of a variety of kinds can be extremely helpful. And the extent to which the government can encourage partnerships not only across national lines, but public-private partnerships that themselves cross national lines, where you've got the private sector, the public sector participating together in joint activities. You can bring to bear the comparative advantage of both sectors in ways that are potentially very powerful, including accelerating the translation of discoveries in research universities and national labs into widespread product use.
Other thoughts, comments? All right, I see some people with hands up already. Sir. Probably a good idea.
I'm other.
Name and identify yourself, please.
My name is Don Reed. I work with a company called Aston Field Renewables, which is a developer of electricity through solar PV in India. And my question relates to policy in a place like India, where, for example, under the Indian tax code, we cannot distribute cash flow from a project which a lender will tell you needs to be in an SPV to protect the asset for the lender, maybe for an equity investor. But if we try and dividend that capital to a sister SPV, whose purpose in life is to generate more clean energy, we have to pay a distribution tax on that. We can't even take the capital and unlend it to the sister SPV without being in contravention of the tax code. So talking about financing energy efficient and clean technology projects, we're not able in India to tap into insurance companies or pension funds. We have contracts, generally, almost in every single case, 25-year must-take agreements with an off-taker. We borrow money from commercial banks who fund 1 day, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and sometimes 12 months, and they lend us money with an average life of 5 years. So we have a 25-year duration asset and a 5-year liability against it. How nuts is that? And if we try and take cash flow from a project and unlend it to a sister company, we have to pay a 17% withholding tax. So I hear the discussions about being more efficient. Here's 2 specific examples for people who get up in the morning, put 10-pound bags of salt in their back and carry them up a hill. These are the sort of practical issues that we face in the wild and woolly world of developing electricity in India.
Could I just ask you to compare that to your experience in the United States, if you have it?
Well, what I say to people is, and I've been saying it ad infinitum, and probably people will be happy to see me leave this afternoon, but in California, you can produce solar power for about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's borrowing money, probably 6.5%, maybe 7%. And I'm guessing the duration on the debt is probably 15 years, something like that. In California, they buy the panels the same values that we do, maybe 60 cents a watt. Balance of system, 60 cents, and then the balance of the equation, so maybe $2 a watt, fully installed, for which they can generate returns to their shareholders, their investors, pay their lenders, and they're producing power at an LCOE of about 8 cents. In India, we're producing it at 14 cents. And we're probably actually putting it in the ground cheaper than they are in California. And what accounts for the difference? The interest expense, the duration of the debt, and the fact that if we actually unlend the capital, which we ought to be able to do to propagate more solar, we have to pay a 17% withholding tax. So I would just challenge this group to think about the fact that with some very simple changes, giving us access to insurance companies, pension funds, which we do not have access to as infrastructure project developers, that we could probably get our cost, our LCOE, down to maybe 10 cents, 9 cents a kilowatt hour.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I would just comment, I mean, this is why I said that tax policy is very important. And on the panel at the moment, we don't have any Indian policymakers, but I think some in the audience have heard the message.
Thank you. And I'd say my former colleagues at the U.S. Department of Energy are probably very interested to talk to you, because it's exactly the type of issue that the U.S. Department of Energy engages in dialogue with Indian counterparts. Lisa.
Thank you. Lisa Friedman from ClimateWire. Great panel. Thank you for doing this. I have a question about the role of government. Todd, both you and John Holdren mentioned OPIC and all of the clean energy investment that OPIC is doing at this, and I think you said 400 megawatts of solar in India. At the same time, Export-Import Bank is financing thousands of megawatts of coal in India and elsewhere. I guess my question, I suppose, is for Todd, but anyone else who wants to take a whack at this, as you know, as the country's highest-ranking climate change official, should the U.S. be helping to finance coal in emerging markets, especially where the greatest rise in greenhouse gas emissions is happening? Thanks.
Well, it's a complicated question, Lisa. There's OPIC has, our development finance institution has policies, so I can't cite chapter and verse, but they have policies that have to do with essentially green lending and limits on their lending to projects that are not green. The export credit agencies, and this is by no means just the United States, this is visible in all of the greenest countries of Europe, whether it's Germany or France or anywhere else, have kept to their historic policy of lending in ways fundamentally that help exports in their own countries. It's not to say that shouldn't change or that it wouldn't be a good idea for it to change or evolve, but the traditional motivator for export credit agencies has been exactly that: exports. I think that this is an area that bears looking at, and I think that it's an area that both our export credit, our Exim Bank, and other export credit agencies would do well to look at. But it's an issue that has been complicated essentially in that way.
Anyone else? Other questions? We have about 3 more minutes, and so in light of the needs for some people to leave quickly, I'm just going to see whether anybody has any closing comments or thoughts they'd like to share.
I'll take one quick crack at a follow-up to that last question, and that is, as a scientist and technologist with responsibility for science and technology policy, it seems to me that a key is going to be to accelerate the development of clean and efficient energy technologies that can replace the otherwise very rapidly expanding use of coal in forms that puts the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We need to invest a lot more, for example, in CO2 capture and storage to make that affordable and attractive in a future environment where there will almost certainly, one way or another, be a price on emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. When we get those technologies in place, the fact that countries like India and China are going to be burning more coal, almost no matter what else happens, will become less menacing, because it will become possible for them to burn the coal without the carbon dioxide emissions that are associated with the existing technologies.
Thanks very much. I'm going to have to call it short just because of time constraints. But we've had a tremendous panel here with diplomats, business people, scientists. Thank you very much to Terry. Thank you very much to Yale for organizing it.
Good job, Dave. Thank you so much.